we need to talk about Poppy Playtime. Chapter 5 was recently released and received very mixed reviews, so I figured it's time that I step out of the shadows a little bit and give my opinion on all things Poppy Playtime. For those of you who don't know me, hello, my name is Squibby, and I used to be a Poppy Playtime and Project Playtime creator back when those games first launched. I was an avid player of Project Playtime back before I knew what Dead by Daylight was. Right from day one of the launch of the game, I was streaming it non-stop on Twitch, even making a couple YouTube videos here and there, and I even had my girlfriend at the time play through Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 and 2, which was a lot of fun. But today I'm sitting here looking back on the 5 story chapters of the game and the multiplayer experience Project Playtime, and I've got a few things I need to get off my chest. Okay, so starting off strong with lack of planning here, we've got that Chapter 1 was a demo and that there was no need for future planning until the demo was successful. When they released Chapter 1, it was just the concept. They didn't have the full story for Poppy Playtime planned out, but then after that, they proceeded to plan out the next few chapters all the way until the end of Chapter 5, which was supposed to be the ending of the story. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to be placing absolutely no blame on Chapter 1 for anything exclusively because it was a demo. But right after Chapter 1 happened and Chapter 2 came out, I was a little bit suspicious that the developers were guilty of changing the lore to avoid letting theorists be correct, which is exactly what Five Nights at Freddy's is known for. As you all may know, the Game Theorists, a very popular game theory channel, have made tons of theory videos on Five Nights at Freddy's and even on Poppy Playtime, but every single time they thought they had it figured out, suddenly the lore changes in the next game and all of their theories are completely invalid. With Five Nights at Freddy's, this clearly looked intentional because the story just stopped making sense, and FNAF is a whole big issue and we're not opening that can of worms today. But with Poppy Playtime, I felt a little bit more disappointed in that because they took the game in a completely different direction that I personally didn't see for it and the theorists didn't see for it as well. Which is why I'm not hard accusing them of doing this, but there are definitely signs of them changing their minds about the lore and the story of the game after the theorists present their ideas. And it was also kind of clear that they were not thinking about the next chapter whenever they would release one. So with Chapter 2, we had the train crashing and then we see the sign that says play care. That's the only thing that's setting up for Chapter 3, but in Chapter 3, we end up going even deeper into the factory, which basically means that everything that could have been from the past areas of the factory is now just gone. And it's also wasted potential, in my opinion. And there is definitely an elephant in the room that we need to address before we go further, which is that the original game creative director, I believe was his title, left Mob along with plenty of other developers, I believe, after the release of Chapter 3. So Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 did not get produced under his direction or creative input. I was even recently watching a YouTube video that was going over the Twitter Q&A that the original creative director did, talking about his plans for Poppy Playtime for Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. And I'm also just going to put this out there. Why is there going to be a 6th chapter? There honestly doesn't need to be. It would have made perfect sense for the game's story to end at the end of Chapter 5. But again, it seems kind of clear that the new creative direction was very different for the story than the old one. So without further ado, we're going to jump straight into wasted potential, which I think is the #1 issue with this entire franchise. Starting off strong, we have the prototype not being Elliot Ludwig, and it's just some orphan named Ollie, I think is the latest confirmed theory on that. I have no idea. but it genuinely seems like a majorly missed opportunity to not have the prototype be Elliot Ludwig. And in that video I was talking about where that creator was going through the Twitter Q&A from the original creative director, he said he didn't want the prototype to be Elliot Ludwig because that was too obvious. I guess I understand you didn't want the players to know who the big bad truly was from the beginning, but you could have leaned into that at least a little bit, right? Honestly, it doesn't matter if people know what's going to happen as long as you still make it happen in a satisfying way. And when I'm saying this, especially for the prototypes example, I mean that when we finally get to see who the prototype is and that it is Elliot, he could be totally corrupted, he could actually be completely evil. Like, there were so many different ways they could have taken it, where the prototype being Elliot Ludwig would have still made total sense, and the prototype's relationship with Poppy would have been very different, so there was so much that they could have explored with that. But ultimately, once the prototype was finally revealed in Chapter 5, I was just kind of like, oh. And obviously I had this reaction for a number of different reasons. First of all being that the design doesn't really make sense to me. I don't understand why he's a clown and he's not actually that scary looking. I mean, I understand from all the lore we got with this character that he basically just like is a combination of a bunch of stuff. I think there was also something about the prototype was supposed to look kind of similar to the shrine that Catnap made for him in Chapter 3. He looks absolutely nothing like that. So again, I'm going to relate this back to the earlier section of the video where I said that I'm lightly accusing the developers of changing the lore after the players figure out what it's going to be. And now, one of the major pieces of wasted potential in this entire franchise is basically every single side character in existence. Starting off with Huggy, we kill him in the first chapter, which, well, kill him. He doesn't actually die, even though he whacks his head a bunch of times and then bleeds everywhere and then falls an incredible height. But he somehow survives because they hinted about that in Chapter 2 because we saw like pieces of fur on the wall or whatever. But again, it's the typical thing of nobody can stay dead. And then for Chapter 5, they're like, guys, we got to do something. Let's bring Huggy back. It's like, okay, did we really need to do that? And even Mommy Longlegs, we kill her by accident by turning on, what's it called? The hydraulic press thingy? I don't even remember what it was. And then she gets stuck in it somehow, and then she dies. And not to mention that we also killed the doctor in Chapter 4, but not actually because, again, nobody can stay dead anymore, so he's now back at the end of Chapter 5. And then in Chapter 5, nothing fucking happens. So in terms of these side characters being useless, I completely understand the whole point of us defeating a new boss in every single chapter. That whole concept completely makes sense, but it's the way that we learn about the bosses and the way that we kill them that is complete bullshit. And when I say that, I mean we learn nothing about Huggy Wuggy. We just kind of see him along the way for Chapter 1. Again, not placing any blame on Chapter 1 because it was just a demo. But by the time we kill him, we knock over a box and he slips and falls. So we end up learning nothing about what Huggy's weaknesses could be or what his strengths are, nothing of the sort. And then we get into Chapter 2 and it's the same thing with Mommy Longlegs. We accidentally crush her to death and we didn't learn anything about her weaknesses, her strengths, her other character traits, nothing. And it also doesn't make sense that we are like the god in this game, and I say that because the Hour of Joy happened, and these toys were able to kill all the staff in this entire ludicrously large factory, but suddenly we can kill them all. Right, okay. Other forms of wasted potential that we see in these chapters is every single plot point or objective that we're given gets thrown away. And a couple big examples that are sticking out to me is in Chapter 4, we need to go get explosives and put them at the foundation of the factory to blow the whole thing up. Well, guess what? After spending, probably 20 minutes getting that done, the prototype just yoinks the explosives and then goes and blows up Safe Haven and kills everybody. But then really looking at the bigger picture here for all of these objectives that mean absolutely nothing, the initial reason why we came back to the factory in the first place was to look for our coworkers. Do y'all even remember that? Because I didn't remember that until I was doing further research for this video. Literally the main reason that we're brought back to the factory in the first place is because we get an envelope with a tape in it that says, everyone thinks the staff disappeared 10 years ago, we're still here, find the flower. But then by the time we actually figure out what happened to the coworkers, everyone was killed. That actually happened, everyone is dead. So now our character didn't have any incentive to be there. So then the next big objective that we're given is from Poppy, where she says, "The orphans, there's orphans here, we need to go save them, they're all below." And then what happens in chapter 5? Within the span of probably 15 seconds, the prototype appears, Poppy says, "What did you do with the orphans?" And the prototype says, "I did what I had to, they're in a better place now." So instantly, that other big objective that we were given for the reason we're playing this fucking game is gone. And then on an even bigger note, the player going into chapter 5, knowing everything that's happened in the previous 4 chapters, thinks that chapter 5 is meant for us to defeat the prototype and finally get to the bottom of whatever is going on. But that doesn't happen. He just gets away. And then of course, Poppy gets kidnapped for the 10th fucking time. This reminds me of an Instagram post that I saw recently that was talking about the Harry Potter franchise, and then across all 7 movies, Draco Malfoy only got like 30 minutes of screen time across 7 movies, but he was so iconic. Poppy, on the other hand, has gotten so little screen time in her own game that she has become completely insignificant, and as a player who's like wrapped up in the story, we fucking hate her. All she's done is screw us over the entire time and make poor decisions that are either going to kill everybody else or us. So again, Poppy's whole character, huge waste of potential. She doesn't end up being the good guy. She just, I think, has good intentions, but she does stupid things, but then she gets kidnapped 10 goddamn times. I don't understand it. And now it is time to talk about the biggest piece of wasted potential in this entire franchise. And that is, you guessed it, Project Playtime. See, now back in the day when Project Playtime was released after Chapter 2, it was meant to be a multiplayer experience that is in the world of Poppy Playtime that people get to play while they're waiting for the next chapter to be developed. And honestly, it was a great idea because they clearly took inspiration from Dead by Daylight, which I hadn't played at the time, so I didn't know about it, and various other multiplayer experiences. And the amount of potential in this game was actually insane, and I don't think the developers ever truly understood that. And I've made a couple of videos on it, including one where I said how to fix Project Playtime after they released Phase 3 and killed the game. And in a recent Discord Q&A by, I think, the current CEO, he did say that they have plans to bring Project Playtime back, but at this point, I don't even care. At the time when Project was released, it had one of the most successful launches on Steam of games in that category. It was breaking some kind of record. Like, already they had a really strong start. And then their old community manager, Brock, he was absolutely carrying the game because he did developer live streams, he was active in other people's Discord servers talking about the game, and he was always talking about how he wanted to improve it. And after he left, it pretty much tanked. So Project Playtime in and of itself was actually a contender against Dead by Daylight in the asymmetrical horror game genre. And while Project Playtime wasn't the most polished experience, it was still advertised as an early access game, so clearly they had lots more in store for its development. And honestly, I was devastated when Project Playtime was killed when Phase 3 was launched. Now, there are a lot of details as to what happened to Project Playtime, and it was kind of apparent that, like I said before, Project Playtime was supposed to be a multiplayer experience to keep people playing something in the Poppy Playtime franchise while they work on the next story chapter. But because Project blew up so much and had so much potential and needed so much care and love and development, there were so many developers that moved away from Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 and into Project Playtime. And eventually the development of the story was so slow that they had to just force people back into developing the story game. And when that happened, the creation of Phase 3 of Project Playtime was an absolute mess. And the game has been left in the same broken state ever since. But wrapping up this video, with all sincerity, I really hope that Mob is somehow able to get a fucking grip and figure out what's going on with their games. I don't mean to be harsh, but as someone who has played so many games at this point and seen wasted potential after failed development, it's getting exhausting. So by all means, if they're still looking to develop Project Playtime, my video on how to fix Project Playtime is still up, and I honestly think all of those suggestions are still perfectly valid. And as for the story games, you guys are on your own for that one. I personally stopped playing Poppy Playtime after chapter 2. But yeah, those are the two major things that are wrong with the franchise. Let me know in the comments below if I missed anything, if you have anything to add, or if you disagree with anything I've said. That's going to be all for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.